Levi's and H&M are among top global clothing brands to suffer production halts in Bangladesh, a garment union leader said Friday after days of violent protests by workers demanding a near tripling of their wages. So there's a reason why garment factories are typically in like the worst countries, and that's because it's a very labor intensive human job. You can't really automate it that well. I'm not an expert, so I don't know the details, but my understanding is that when it comes to garment working, the specific ways in which patterns or fabric is stitched together for clothing requires a degree of precision and adaptability that machines cannot reliably replicate. And if they could, those machines would be more expensive than just having extremely cheap labor in these countries, you know? So again, there's some like very specific detail to like the way fabric tends to stretch when pulled, and it means you get inconsistent results or something. That's why there are lots of processes that are basically just done in factories. For example, metal machining and plastic mold filling, both of those are done really easily by machines, because in both cases, you're either using a machine with a tool to do a very specific, exactly the same routine every time, or you're filling a mold. And filling a mold is like the easiest thing for a machine to do, you know, like how Legos are made, right? But when it comes to garment factories, hold on, Bangladesh garment factory workers. Let's just take a look inside these plants, huh? By the way, about 4 million people work in them. When you wear fast fashion, when you shop at H&M, Levi's, basically any like, mid-range clothing brand in the United States, this is where your clothes come from. Congratulations. Literally, it's not a factory line. It's a bunch of tables with a sewing machine, and they go over them clothing, fabric block by fabric block. I don't know the terms, and they make your clothes. The hands of slaves have touched your clothes. That's a Bolt. Thank you. That's a level of personal engagement you don't normally get with, sweatshops. Normally, sweatshop workers just oversee and facilitate it. But no. Here they touched your clothing. So, you can feel good about that. Yeah, there's a lot of this. You can Google like Bangladeshi garment factory worker if you want. You've seen sweatshop photos before. It's mostly women who work here because it's, sewing. And obviously, there's social stereotypes concerning, gender roles in this kind of work. I remember after COVID, things actually got a lot worse as well. You can tell which photos are post-COVID because you'll see stuff like this, or everyone will be wearing a mask, A lot of people got sick in these factories. It is sorry, I'll just put up one more photo here because it really is it's quite it's a lot worse. Imagine cracking in on this for what, 10, 12 hours a day? Like, you're line 20, seat 2, sit down. We have a bunch of t-shirts we're going to sell for $9 at Target that you need to make, okay? Can you get a suicide net, a photo of the suicide nets outside of these? Sure. I don't know if these places have them, actually. Another reason why this work tends to be done in cheaper countries is because I think that spacing out all of this area for production is really inefficient. See, this is only one floor, I think. There have been a couple of instances where they try to make this, like, multi-storied, and there were big collapses. In fact, I think there was one in Bangladesh. Yes, this was famous. Death toll 1,127 from a Bangladesh factory collapse. Was this garment workers? Yes. The world's worst garment industry disaster. I think the reason this happened was because this building was owned by like a crime lord, basically, and he was paying off local inspectors and contractors and engineers to like just build shit on the cheap for him. And he wanted to build additional levels to this big, like, multi-story facility, and he didn't get anything weight checked or rated. And yeah, I think he was on the run after. I think he fled. Anyway, one of the reasons this got a lot of attention is because obviously, like, this factory was making clothes that you guys wear. Like, a bunch of Western companies were buying these clothes. So anyway, the point that I'm laboriously getting at here is that it's an industry which at the moment is done by humans. It's not like an automatable process, at least not at that level. Might be in the future, and if it is, that's probably a good thing. So didn't they also lock the workers inside? I don't remember, but it's probably safe to assume they did. Right now, their wages in these Bangladeshi sweatshops are something in the ballpark of like $80 a day, if I remember correctly. 75. Oh, sorry. My apologies. I'm totally off. Totally off. I said 80 a day, didn't I? 75 a month. My apologies. $75 a month. My apologies. Dozens of factories have been ransacked by striking workers, with several hundred others shuttered by their owners to avoid vandalism. Among them are many of the country's bigger factories, who make clothing for almost all major Western brands and retailers. Kalpona Akhter, president of the Bangladesh Garment and Industrial Workers Federation, told AFP they include Gap, Walmart, H&M, Zara, Inditex, bestseller Levi's, Marks and Spencer's, Primark, and Aldi. That's a lot of people implicated there. This is one of the reasons why there's such a huge gap in cost between fast fashion clothing brands and like American or Western made clothing brands. This is the reason why it seems like you can buy a t-shirt for like $8 to $10, and then there's like a gap, and then you're buying t-shirts for like $40 or $50. Likewise with like dress shirts. Like you can get a dress shirt for like $25 easy. And then there's like a gap, and it's like, oh, actually they're like $150. And the reason for that is because the costs scale enormously when you start using like Western labor, Western materials. Which, by the way, as somebody who's rapidly becoming a fashion snob, as you can tell by this 6-year-old t-shirt that I'm wearing on stream right now, I think it is actually not a bad idea to like look into alternatives to fast fashion. Also for your benefit, because those clothes tear really quickly. If you buy like cheap, ill-fitting clothing, it's going to like stretch out or tear up or just generally not fit you that well for very long. But if you get a nice, good piece of clothing, like just a good pair of jeans or like a nice, good shirt or two, you can go a good distance. You can carry that shit with you out for a while. And I think it's worth it in a lot of cases. It's like getting a nice pair of shoes, rather than just like having $40 shoes that keep running through over and over again. Vaush, slave labor is bad because they make uncomfortable clothes. My primary moral objection to slave labor is that they just make shit clothes. Honestly, what are these guys doing? These Bangladeshi factory workers, what are these? A skill issue. Come on, get some good old fashioned American made fabric. All right, they're much better. Anyway, seriously. So far, these protests have left 2 workers dead and dozens more injured. So protests over stuff like this tend to get very brutal very quickly. The reason for that is because Bangladesh relies heavily on the industry that it gets from Western clothing buyers. So what we're talking about right now is basically the heart of, I want to call it social democracy here because I don't hate social democrats, only a little. I hate them a little. What we're seeing right here is a contradiction at the heart of social democracy in concept. It's not fundamental to social democracy, and it's not something that will instantly be fixed without social democracy, but it's something that tends to get ignored by social democrats. And it's that if you make the living standards in your country better, that often displaces the worst and most grueling work to the global proletariat. This is like a third worldist perspective. Maybe you get rid of slavery in the United States, and we did a while ago, but that doesn't mean we don't still benefit from it. We do. We do in Africa, we do in Southeast Asia, we do in Latin America. All we have to do is keep it out of the country. It's bad press if it's in our country. Oh yeah, except if it's being done by prisoners. But outside of our country, it's like, you have clothing brands and like chocolate companies and stuff who will be like, we've tried to remove slavery from our production process, and we've given it our best shot. And then like an investigative journalist will look into it, and it's like, oh, it turns out like all of these factories are using slave labor or child labor or whatever. So the fundamental problem here is that there's like there's a weird geopolitical dynamic going on. Okay, so how do I like summarize this, because it's very complicated. Okay, making a country go from poor to rich, like low level development to high level development, is really difficult. There are lots of ways to do it. Okay, but often what happens to countries that have not a lot of money but a lot of people is a kind of trap, something that seems to be good for them at first, but in the long run ends up hurting them. What is that thing? Foreign investment. Now, not all kinds of foreign investment, but some specific kinds. Because what will often happen is you'll have a country where people are desperately poor, like Bangladesh. Not the wealthiest country in the world, just so you know. But they do have a lot of a specific resource, namely people, labor. And for some industries, labor is the main resource needed, like the garment industry. So what Western companies will do is they'll say, look, we want to produce cheap goods, but if we were to use textile factories and garment factories that operate entirely in the United States, all of these clothes would be pretty expensive. Now, that is how things worked for the majority of human history. Stuff was made locally. But we live in a global world now. We can benefit from the lower cost of labor in Bangladesh. We can pay you guys less than what we would have to pay American workers, significantly less. And we would be able to provide clothes cheaper to everyone globally. Isn't that a good deal? And importantly, it gives people in Bangladesh jobs, which they need. It also gives them money from Western companies, because Western companies buy the clothing from the garment factories, which gives the garment factories the money that they then give to their workers, albeit not much of it, and that money then spreads in the economy. I ask you, how exactly would Bangladeshi workers be getting foreign money otherwise? I mean, they need foreign money. Like, Bangladesh is not going to escape the third world entirely through internal production. Some kind of foreign investment or foreign payout, some kind of, economic exchange with the West would benefit them significantly. So how about we do it this way? Does that make sense? Is everyone following me so far? Is everyone on board with what I'm saying so far? We good? 2 people are good. Great. Okay. So that seems like a good deal, right? And to an extent it is. But there's a cap. That logic will underpay your workers and in exchange will do this business can only take you so far. Past a point, it doesn't really pull you any further. It doesn't pull you out of the third world, namely. A really good example of this historically would be the relationship that Western corporations have had with oil in third world countries like Latin America or whatever, or Middle East or Africa, where you will have like this repeating pattern of Western companies investing in and heavily subsidizing oil extraction from these countries because they have a lot of it. And then those countries going, hey, we don't actually like only making like 5% of the wealth that is being extracted from our land. We'd like to negotiate a better deal. Or maybe we would like to, I don't know, nationalize our industry. And that's how democratically elected socialist leaders get assassinated by the CIA. It's a big deal. So what happens is you have undemocratic regimes like Bangladesh's, varying levels of democracy here. But I wouldn't exactly call them a free and flourishing democracy. Even if they are a democracy, hold on. Just to make sure I'm not mixing up Bangladesh with Myanmar in my head or whatever. They're a flawed democracy, correct? Let's see. Parliamentary representatives, military dictator, observed an election. Oh, just in 1990. Okay. They moved over pretty recently. Whether or not they're a dictatorship is actually kind of irrelevant. The point is that the government understands that the money they get, the system that they work on, the system they rely on, it relies on Western investment, which means you get this constant battle, but which is kind of like a proxy battle between the third world proletariat, right? Like the textile workers, and governments which want to suppress their labor activism because they want to keep the status quo. The government wants the West to maintain its relationship because it's usually beneficial to the government officials. In many cases, in countries like this, the government officials are also heavily profiting off of the industries that the West is using for resource extraction. So you'll have this pattern where the wealthiest people in these third world countries will be people who own the garment factories that underpay their workers that sell to the West, right? So you have a tendency of corruption, which then incentivizes them to maintain their control over that economic system by using the political apparatus as a way of maintaining that rule. And the way they do that often is by suppressing strikes and killing strikers and arresting striking, like union leaders. So All this being said, the reason I'm talking about this is because I think that there is a tendency for liberals to hand wave this away and say like, oh, well, the market dictates the price of labor, and the market has dictated that the price of labor in Bangladesh is $75 a month. So what are you going to do? Which is bullshit, obviously. The idea that government policy can't affect the like price of a good is ludicrous. Like that, the argument, the natural consequence of that argument would be that the market dictated the price of labor of a slave is $0, and what are you gonna do? Which is total fucking bullshit. Obviously, if the market forces, which will, by the way, always grind the labor cost down to zero if possible, like the market forces, if they could, would make you a slave as well. It's policy that stops that from happening. Obviously, policy can be used to fix these problems as well. So that liberal argument is total bullshit. I don't think foreign investment is entirely bad. I think it's possible for a country to do well economically, even with foreign investment in production. Japan, Singapore, South Korea all have their problems, but are pretty clear examples of how to effectively engage in like a global economic system in a way that does lead to a lot of local enrichment and doesn't just involve like selling out your labor at the lowest price. The goal, I think, for any internationalist, for any socialist, should be to try to elevate the third world by not having their economies be entirely reliant on selling their cheapest resource for pennies on the dollar to the West, whether that be oil, coal, diamonds, uranium, or human labor. Definitely the human labor. Definitely not that. So yeah, I guess solidarity with the workers. Sorry, it's a little more complicated of an issue. I just wanted to talk about like this dynamic that I'm describing here is happening all over the world. It is the modern method of resource extraction. This is neocolonialism. Old style colonialism, where you literally just like invade a country and set up a colony. Not that common these days, Not unless you're Israel or something. I don't know. It's not that common these days. Neocolonialism, however, seeks to engage in the exact same process of resource extraction without the military occupation. That's the whole point. The idea is that in the olden days, in order to get this level of wealth extraction from Bangladesh, we would have needed like a Raj tier military occupation. But nowadays, we can just utilize the global economy and its economic pressures. If this isn't inherent to social democracy, why is this always a critique I hear of it? Just curious. Because in my experience, people who advocate for social democracy locally and not socialism have a tendency to completely fucking ignore the relationship between Western purchasing power and the price of labor and extracted goods from the developing world. Again, it's not an inherent problem. Socialists could do the same thing, but it is a weird tendency that I've noticed. It makes me, I don't know, there's some kind of like weird, like social democrat neo-colonial chauvinism that leads people to think that if they can just get their like Medicare for all in their country and their borders, that they have everything set. I don't really know. Liberalism is a poison, friends. Anyway, just remember that a rising tide will lift all boats. The world would benefit from a first world Bangladesh in the same way that the world has benefited from South Korea and from Japan becoming first world as well. Have they not? Has Japan becoming a first world nation in a modern, like economically productive industrial sense, has this not produced a great deal of good for the world and what they've been able to do and produce? Clearly. They're a mass exporter, and they have been for a while. We want everyone to do well. We keep seeing this time and time again. The economy is at its most productive when the middle class is at its most powerful. When the wealthy have all the wealth, what do? They hide it in bank accounts. They hide it in offshore investment account. Like, it doesn't go back into the economy. Poor people and middle class people, when they have money, spend it. It gets used. It circulates. And that logic also applies to Bangladesh. If Bangladeshi workers had money, if they had resources, not only would they be able to produce more and more interesting things, they would be able to buy them too. And that would stimulate the world economy. And that would overall mean that the economy is able to facilitate and respond to the higher prices for goods that we would see if we started producing stuff locally or producing stuff with good wages. Maybe clothing should be more expensive. I understand that sounds like weird or like, oh, but what about people who don't have enough clothes? First of all, Respectfully, I challenge you on this. Right now in America, I really don't think it is a significant problem that people can't get enough clothes. There are people who struggle from this, certainly, but if you want clothes, there are a lot of clothes in this country, and there are outlets you can get them from. It's like, not to say it's not a problem at all, but I want us to like proportionally scale our understanding of this issue relative to Bangladesh, a country with 160 million people being, desperately underpaid. Like, is it worth it? You know? Not to mention a lot of the people in our own country who can't afford, or wouldn't be able to afford more expensive clothing. Why wouldn't they? Well, probably because they're not being paid that well. Why aren't they being paid that well? Well, that's probably because they're victims of the exact same process of economic extraction that's happening with the Bangladeshi workers, just at a lower level. We've exported the worst of the proletariat, of the grueling labor to the international proletariat. We keep a lot of it locally, right? It's the same fundamental problem. And this is why I think, socialism must be the answer. Whether it be domestic or international, the problem here fundamentally is the relationship between the worker and the owner. And when properly addressed, I don't know. I think people should be happy, is my political belief. I think good things are good, in my opinion. Yeah, fun things are fun.